There are some wetlands on the property. The only wetland that we plan to disturb would be the road crossing. Other than that, we don't plan on having any wetland disturbances. There's one water course that we will be traversing over. And then, of course, with wetlands in the town wetland code, they have something called a buffer. That buffer is 100 feet from the wetland. And again, the wetland, I refreshed some of the reports. Remember, the wetland was flagged by Phil Demick, and the wetland flags are located by Dan Merritt's. So the location of the wetland was determined in the field and actually picked up by surveyor. From that information, we come up with a plan with the zoning code as well as the sketch plan. This is not our intention to build. We have a long road in front of us. We realize that. I've been before this board for many years. This is not the first time we've done business together. And we feel this is a very viable plan. We've been doing this a long time. And some developers come in and they show houses in buffer areas, wetland areas, and unrealistic plans. We spend a lot of time preparing the plans before we come to meetings, to make sure that they're right, make sure they're viable plans, not to insult this board or any other board. Tonight I brought with me my zoning attorney, Adam Weston. We ended up talking a little while. Adam, we've worked for several years together, and I find he's very useful in explaining to towns and homeowners who sometimes aren't familiar what the zoning laws are. And being in the industry for almost 30 years, you hear people say, well, I think the code is this, and I think the code is that. Adam gets paid to, not guess at what we think it is, but what it actually is. So not only hearing it from the developer, the town has an attorney, Adam's an attorney, the two of them talk the same language, get some resolution, and I can answer your technical questions. And other than that, the other issue I think that a lot of homeowners are concerned with are stormwater, flooding, wetland disturbance. All that will be addressed. And like I said, we're going to be here for a very long time. And there'll be a lot of studies done. We're at the very, very beginning of the process, but we're following the process the way it's supposed to be followed. And Adam will get a little bit more depth, but basically we start with a sketch plan. And you'll constantly hear us refer to that sketch plan because that's how the process is. As we move along the process, we'll start talking about a cluster subdivision. And then that will be a plan that will be a lot of input going back and forth. The layout, the size of the homes that will be built there, the wetland disturbance, the flooding, the stormwater, all these things. Doing this a long time, I know people have concerns about those things. I do this for a living. I do it every day. This is all I do. The stormwater will be captured. There will be a zero rate of increase, which means whatever stormwater leaves the property now will leave the property after we develop it. There will be a computer-generated report. It will be about 3 inches thick. We'll build some basins on the property. Some will function to purify the water. Some will function to contain the water. So that's as far as the stormwater goes. I'm simplifying a little bit, but it's, there'll be custom structures made to retain the water. It's down to a fraction of an inch. As far as the wetland crossing, we need to access the property. Any wetland we disturb will be replaced. Any buffer area that's disturbed will be replaced. So once again, we've got very little buffer disturbance, and we've got very, very little wetland disturbance. Even though the site contains a large amount of wetlands, the geometry of which the wetlands are located on this site is kind of nice because it's pretty much contained. It gives us plenty of room to develop. project up in Somers. It was a 180 project. Westchester Land Trust was involved. Town of Somers won a Smart Growth Award. We look at these kind of things, and this will be an open space conservation subdivision, which means we're going to minimize the disturbance on the site for development. So I think this is the kind of project that we want. So it's not going to be sprawling roads and sprawling mansions throughout the site. We're going to minimize the area that we plan to develop. So I am a local developer. I've done a ton of work in the town of Ossining, Village Drive, Mount Pleasant. I have a lot of respect for the board. I feel the board has respect for me. I do have a proven track record, and I know that people who live in the immediate area are concerned. They have a right to be. So at the end of the day, when this project is done, we can assure you that one thing is for you. Anyway, when we construct the project, we start from the low side and work our way up. The very first thing that gets replaced is drainage. Not only this project, but every project I do. It's a smart way of doing it. We're very successful in doing it that way. So this project will also be handled. We have we've got an aqueduct that goes through the property. The aqueduct, I think, is about 300 feet. We're in communication with New York City DEP. And when we did Briar Pond off of Morningside Drive, that was also an empty aqueduct, and we've actually constructed houses in there. So we do have a dialogue going with the New York City DEP. We don't think it's going to be an issue. So I just wanted to let that be known. So I guess that's it. Adam, can I get up to say anything?
Sure. Jim said most of what I was going to say. We're here really for something very preliminary, for lack of a better word, as your board knows, and I presumably some of the public knows. This conventional plan is just a tool, and it allows us really to go into the design phase and to tell us what the maximum lot count is. We've given you what's required under your ordinance, what's required by law, to allow you to make that determination, both under your subdivision regulations and your zoning law. The provision provides for this process. Section 278 of the town law, the state law, provides for this process. This is a tool for you to get to the maximum number, which in this case is 24. If in your judgment, based on what we've shown you on this site, the sketch plan is required, is an approvable plan, is a plan that is a reasonable plan, the next step is for you to tell us that's the case, so that we can go back and, for lack of a better word, do our homework, come back with a more detailed cluster plan, which does things like reduce impervious surface and moves the lots around to make it a more sound plan environmentally, and the various studies that would need to go with that and move the process ahead. For lack of a better word, this doesn't commit, it's not an approval. It doesn't commit the board to any specific development or design or to any environmental conclusions. But it is something that is part of the rational process and part of what the law requires for us to go ahead and come back with it.
Is there no sort of plan question?
It's exactly what it is.
We have a review. David, would you like to explain the process and
Sure,
please the review?
sure. And I try to weave the process into the memo, or I just go through the memo, and then if there are any questions about the memo or the process, we can talk about that. But just to try to make it crystal clear, I know it's been said about 2 or 3 times perhaps, the conventional subdivision sketch plan is not what the applicant intends to build. Can't talk any louder. You can come closer now. So, as has been said, it's a tool for establishing a maximum lot count. Just to be clear about that, it's not what the applicant would like to build. So, as we usually do in our memo, we laid out what it was that we reviewed. And there are 3 drawings: the conventional sketch plan, which is up on the board there, a topographical map, and a third map entitled Road Profiles - Conventional. We also reviewed a wetlands map, which was delineated, as Jim just said, by Paul Janicki, and we think that that wetlands map is a reasonable map. Number two, a report entitled Wetlands Survey, which was a functional analysis of the wetlands on the property, and we think that the wetlands survey is a very reasonable document as well. A survey of the property, and fourthly, an environmental assessment form dated February 18, 2013. Just a little bit of background. The address of the property is 16 Barnes Road. It's located in the town of Ossining. The property is approximately 31.6 acres in size and is comprised of 3 tax parcels, a fairly large tax parcel and 2 smaller tax parcels. And it's zoned R40 one-family residence district, which means it's basically a zone which permits single-family homes on lots that are at least 40,000 square feet in size, which is just a little bit less than an acre. The proposal is a 24-lot cluster subdivision with a potential for a density bonus for the provision of affordable housing in accordance with section 234 of the zoning law. And as we've been saying, although the applicant is not proposing a conventional subdivision, one of the first steps in the process of seeking approval for a cluster subdivision is the submission of a conventional subdivision sketch plan for the purpose of establishing a maximum lot count for clustering purposes, and only for clustering purposes. In terms of the purpose and intent of clustering, section 200-31A of the zoning law states that the general purposes and intent of cluster development are to enable and encourage flexibility of design and development of land in such a manner as to promote the most appropriate use of land, to facilitate the adequate and economical provision of streets and utilities, to preserve the natural and scenic qualities of open lands, to protect areas of meaningful ecological value, and to reserve suitable lands for park and recreation purposes. And section 200-31B of the zoning law states that it's the planning board's authority, and it says the planning board is hereby authorized simultaneously with the approval of a subdivision plat to modify applicable provisions of this chapter, subject to conditions set forth herein and in section 281, which is now section 278 of the town law. This procedure may be followed, 1, when applied for by the owner of land to be subdivided, if in the judgment and discretion of the planning board, its application would benefit the town by satisfying one or more of the purposes set forth in subsection A above. Subsection A above is the purposes and intent section, which I just quoted from the zoning law, which talks about enabling flexibility of design, to promote the most appropriate use of land, to facilitate the adequate and economical provision of streets and utilities, to preserve the natural and scenic qualities of open lands, and to protect areas of meaningful ecological value, to reserve suitable lands for park and recreation purposes. So those are some of the things that one tries to achieve in doing a cluster subdivision as opposed to a conventional layout. As you see with respect to the plan that is up on the board, just about every bit of the property would be developed with lots for single-family detached homes. That's a conventional layout where all of the property is used and developed in sort of a cookie-cutter fashion. The cluster development would be comprised of a much more compact development where the number of homes would be clustered or more compactly developed on the subject property. And then we move on to the discussion of lot count. And section 231D2 of the zoning law states, with respect to clustering and the determining of a maximum lot count, that the number of building lots or dwelling units permitted in a cluster development shall in no case exceed the number which could have been permitted in the judgment of the planning board if the land were subdivided into lots conforming to all normally applicable requirements of this chapter. That would be the zoning law, the land subdivision regulations, the Westchester County Department of Health regulations, and all other applicable regulations and restrictions. And then the zoning law says that the basis for this planning board determination shall be a conventional subdivision sketch plan as described in section 5.1 of the land subdivision regulations, plus some such other information as may be required by said board. So it's really important at this point to point out that the zoning law is not saying that there needs to be a plan that's developed to the level of detail to be approvable and receive preliminary plat approval, but rather a subdivision sketch plan, and the items that are required in the application for a subdivision sketch plan are laid out in the subdivision regulations. Section 5.1, which is now section 176.22 of the town subdivision regulations, states that the sketch plan, which is the initial submission to the planning board, shall show the proposed layout of streets, lots, and other features sketched roughly on a print of a survey of the property with contour lines at intervals of no more than 5 feet, and shall also show or otherwise include the information specified in section 176.24 1 through 8, 11, and 19, as well as a sketch of the vicinity map described in 176.24b of this article. So the zoning law is saying, and I'm trying to point out, that what's required for the planning board to make a lot count determination is a sketch plan, not a fully refined subdivision plat as defined in the subdivision regulations, but rather a sketch plan sketched roughly on a survey of the property. So that's the level of detail we're supposed to be looking at this point in time. And then moving on to the seeker process, or the State Environmental Quality Review Act process. On April 15 of this year, the planning board sent a notice to the other involved agencies regarding the project, in which the planning board declared its intent to serve as the lead agency under the requirements of the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act. And in accordance with the provisions of seeker, the planning board received no objection to its declared intent, and therefore became the lead agency for the purposes of seeker in May of this year. The planning board role at this point in time involves the determination of a maximum lot count based upon a conventional subdivision sketch plan for the purposes of clustering. We do not believe that this is an action under seeker, which must be preceded by a determination of significance, that is a positive declaration or a negative declaration, or conceivably a conditional negative declaration. The planning board will, however, at the appropriate time make such a determination, meaning when the cluster subdivision plan comes before the planning board will make a determination as to whether there's maybe significant adverse environmental impact, but not at this point in time. So, in terms of our analysis and recommendation, the subdivision sketch plan specified above, which is the one that's on the board right here, is not the first iteration of such plan submitted by the applicant, but rather there have been multiple versions of this plan submitted to the planning board for review, and we've commented on these prior iterations. We've reviewed the conventional subdivision sketch plan and other materials mentioned above in relation to the town zoning law, its subdivision regulations, as well as all other applicable regulations and restrictions, and find that based upon our area of purview, that the 24-lot conventional sketch plan, or sketch layout rather, is a plan which the planning board could permit for the purposes of establishing a maximum lot count in the context of the clustering provisions of the zoning law. And as a footnote to that, we say that this is not to say that the planning board is in a position to grant preliminary subdivision plan approval to the sketch plan. The requirements for an application for preliminary subdivision plan approval as prescribed by the subdivision regulations are at a much more complete and a higher level of detail. And that is basically our
Recommendation basically is to the 24 lots.
the
sketch plan.
The layout that's been submitted, the conventional layout, the sketch plan that's been submitted, meets the zoning regulations in terms of all of the dimensional requirements of the zoning. The wetland layout, or the wetland survey that's been done, is very reasonable. The wetlands are being preserved on this plan to the maximum extent possible. The homes are located outside of the wetlands, outside of the buffers as well. So we believe that this plan meets the requirements for a subdivision sketch layout for the purposes of establishing lot count. Not for anything beyond that, but for the purposes of establishing lot count.
Any members of the board have a question?
Mr. Weeks, can the participants outside the board raise any questions or have any communication with the board
I'll
on
take
this?
a couple of questions, but we're not, this is, again, this is for a number count and a number count only. I'll take a couple of questions. Yes.
George, when we met at the last meeting and I asked you, do you have to show that you can put 24 houses on this property before you can say, we will give you 24 cluster houses? And you told me yes. At that time, please, at that time, it was going to the Environmental Action Committee. And and I don't know how to pronounce Dan's last name, was to come out and see the property, which he did. We talked about the problem with the slopes, and we talked about this from the beginning, whether it's a cluster plan or this plan, there's a 40-foot slope that will be disturbed, and the Environmental Action Committee
You're saying
gave a
that the
report.
cluster plan will do this, we haven't even seen the cluster plan.
Excuse me, I'm seeing this as the cart before the horse. He needs to prove he can put 24 houses there. I'm not seeing proof of that. To put 24 houses there, a road must go into a 40-foot slope. Well, if he can't put 24 houses there with that road, how can you give him 24 houses? I don't get it. I don't understand.
I'm sorry, Dave, did you want to address that, or?
I thought we already did address it.
Well, I'm baffled by the fact that you're saying, it's okay to say I can put a road in a 40-foot slope and put 24 houses in, and you're gonna give me 24 houses now in the backfields and in the other areas so that we can preserve the wetlands. You're not showing to us, that these 24 houses are viable houses.
What we had to do was, as was explained, we need a sketch plan, and that is to determine the count.
A sketch plan of
And
the,
you're giving,
wait.
I'm sorry,
No, it's
excuse
okay.
me.
Then just for clarification, the sketch plan of the subdivision,
Correct.
of the cluster housing.
Plan of the
No, no, not the.
No.
Okay, of the subdivision, got it.
If Mr. Zappi were held to the same R40 that everybody here has been held to, he would have to prove that he can do this. We're saying he cannot. 24 houses cannot be put on that property at R40. And by saying it can be, I'm still waiting for Dan to come back to me to tell me about a mudslide that happened in a 15-foot slope that I asked in June, and I was supposed to hear back. What caused that mudslide? You're gonna dig into a 40-foot slope and tell me that my neighbor's house isn't gonna get affected and my house isn't gonna get affected? I'm sorry. I'm
Okay,
very
so I guess from my understanding what Wendy's saying, for clarification, David, was it you who came out or you did the evaluation of the cluster plan, or who was it that you had a commission, somebody come out and review that? And I guess in principle, from what I'm hearing, is that to satisfy the first level of decision-making, it has to be unquestionably capable, Mr. Zappi has to be unquestionably capable to build as he's planned on this sketch. Is that correct? Without any question about the environmental impact, without any question about the impact to the road, the preservation of wetlands, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think what you're saying is that you've done that study, and you say that it can be done unquestionably, and because of that, then he can move to the next step. And I think that's where I think a good group of people have some questions about, and I think it's not unreasonable. So if maybe Mr. Zappi can explain to us, or his attorney, how that in question, or whoever, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get clarification.
I'm not saying exactly what you're saying, but I'm saying that given the level of detail at which we're supposed to be looking at this sketch layout, I'm saying within my area of purview, I believe that this meets the requirements of a subdivision sketch layout in terms of being outside of the wetlands, in terms of to the maximum extent practicable, in terms of being outside of the buffers, in terms of the lots meeting the zoning requirements. my level of purview goes to a certain distance.
Okay.
I'm saying within my level, my area of purview, this meets the regulation.
So is there somebody maybe with more expertise that might be able to provide you with insight that might change your purview?
No,
Mr. Chairman, may I
no,
respond?
maybe you're misinterpreting what I'm saying. I believe that my level of expertise for my area of purview is as high as it needs to be. I've been doing this for about 36 years,
Okay, so you're the expert then.
within my area of purview.
And I will say that the law says what it says, and your question is based really on a false premise. We don't have to unquestionably prove anything. That wouldn't even be the standard at the end of the process. We're at the very beginning of the process. What we have to show is that this is reasonable subdivision that complies with the regulations, which it does, it complies with the law. We have to go through all the issues in that EAC memo and all the issues that were just raised about slope. That's all going to be part of the secret review. And it makes sense to do that analysis of what's actually being proposed to be done. So that, excuse me, so that the board and the public can understand what the true impacts are, and that the board can actually make a decision whether